Imagine waking up one day and realizing that every decision you've ever made, every friendship you've pursued, every career step you've taken, every love you've either clung to or let slip away, was not entirely your own. That deep beneath your conscious choices lies another force, invisible yet commanding, shaping your life with quiet authority. What if you discovered that the very things you fear, the very impulses you've repressed, and the very shadows you've denied were not enemies to avoid, but the hidden architects of your fate? You might think of yourself as free, as rational, as a person steering the ship of your own destiny. But Jung would whisper from the grave, you are possessed, not by spirits, but by the darkness you refuse to confront. The paradox is brutal. The more you avoid the darkness within, the more it controls you. The more you deny your shadow, the anger you suppress, the envy you disguise, the desires you bury, the stronger its grip becomes. Imagine a prisoner who refuses to look at the chains binding his hands. He insists he is free because he chooses where to look, but in truth, every step he takes is dictated by the weight of iron he refuses to acknowledge. Is this not the condition of modern man? We chase happiness, freedom, and peace, but what if the very pursuit blinds us to the fact that the enemy is not outside, it is within? Consider this unsettling contradiction, the parts of yourself you've sworn to never admit, the selfishness, the rage, the craving for recognition, the lust for power, might be the very key to the freedom you long for. What if the shadows you've been taught to fear hold the map to your liberation? Does it terrify you to think that your salvation is hidden inside the very impulses you've spent a lifetime burying? Carl Jung called this unacknowledged side of ourselves the shadow. And he warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. But ask yourself, how much of your life has already been written by a script you did not know existed? How many relationships have been poisoned, not by the flaws of others, but by the projections of your own unacknowledged fears and desires? How many choices have you justified with noble reasons, when in truth they were dictated by impulses you refuse to admit? You might feel a shiver at the thought that your worst nightmare could be true, that you are not yet free. That every time you flinch away from discomfort, every time you silence a thought that scares you, every time you convince yourself you are good, while denying the impulses that make you human, you are not escaping darkness. You are feeding it. Like a beast caged in the basement of your psyche, your shadow grows restless, distorting the air, leaking through cracks, appearing in dreams, erupting in moments of rage, jealousy, or despair. You say, that wasn't me. But what if it was the truest part of you, the part you refuse to face? So here lies the great question, the one that gnaws at the edges of consciousness. What if the life you think you're living is only half a life, because you're terrified to embrace the other half? What if freedom, real freedom, does not come from becoming more virtuous, more positive, more light, but from walking into the very darkness you fear and shaking hands with it? Could it be that your greatest enemy is not the shadow itself, but your refusal to look it in the eyes? You might wonder, if this is true, then why have entire civilizations built religions, moral codes, and cultures designed to keep us from the darkness? Why are we told to banish it, to silence it, to conquer it? Could it be that society itself thrives on our fear of our own shadow? That your obedience, your conformity, your desperate pursuit of approval, all flow from your refusal to face what waits in the dark? And if so, then what would happen if you finally turned toward the abyss inside yourself? Not to destroy it, but to listen. This is where the journey begins, not in the safety of light, but in the trembling recognition that without the courage to face your darkness, you will never truly be free. The question is no longer whether you have a shadow, you do. The question is, will you continue to let it direct your fate in secret, or will you walk into the darkness willingly, knowing that only there lies the key to liberation? The tragedy of human life is not that we are weak, but that we are strangers to ourselves. From the moment you were a child, you were taught what parts of yourself were acceptable and what parts were dangerous. Parents praised obedience, teachers rewarded conformity, religion sanctified purity, and society demanded masks of politeness. Slowly, piece by piece, you learn to exile the impulses that threaten to disrupt harmony. Did you feel envy toward a sibling? You learn to call it shameful. Did you feel anger toward authority? You swallowed it down, forcing a smile. Did you feel a hunger for recognition or power? You were told such ambitions were arrogant, even sinful. And so, without even realizing it, you began constructing a false self, the persona Jung described as the mask you wear for the world, while banishing everything else into the dark cellar of the unconscious. This repression, Jung warned, does not eliminate the unwanted parts of the psyche. It only buries them alive. And here lies the hidden problem: what you refuse to face within yourself does not die, it waits. Like shadows in a dimly lit room, your denied impulses crouch just outside awareness, shaping your behaviors through projection, slips of the tongue, inexplicable moods, and destructive patterns. Nietzsche once observed that, "We are unknown to ourselves, we men of knowledge." The brilliance of this statement is that it exposes the irony of human pride: we build technologies, conquer nations, and decode the stars, yet we fail to confront the abyss within our own souls. We escape into the external world precisely because the internal one terrifies us. Psychology has given names to this hidden struggle. Freud spoke of repression. Jung expanded it into the shadow. Modern neuroscience reveals that much of our behavior originates in unconscious processing before we are even aware of making a choice. Consider this: by the time you consciously decide to act, your brain has already set the wheels in motion milliseconds earlier. What does this say about your sense of control? How much of what you think of as you is really just the tip of an iceberg of unseen forces? But perhaps philosophy sharpens the wound even more deeply. Schopenhauer believed that beneath all rational justifications lies the blind, irrational will, a force of raw desire that compels life itself. To him, human beings are not creatures of reason but puppets of a ceaseless hunger for existence. Sartre, on the other hand, argued that we are condemned to be free, forced to choose, yet often fleeing into self-deception to avoid facing the weight of our own responsibility. When combined with Jung's insights, these views suggest something chilling: we are both enslaved and free at once. Enslaved by unconscious drives we refuse to confront, yet condemned to carry the illusion that we are the authors of our choices. This is why you sabotage relationships without understanding why. Why you lash out in anger and later regret it. Why you pursue goals that, once achieved, leave you hollow. The shadow directs your life like an invisible puppeteer, tugging at strings you refuse to acknowledge. But here's the cruel twist: society depends on this blindness. If every individual were to confront their own darkness, the fragile machinery of civilization might tremble. Institutio NS thrive on compliance, and compliance thrives on fear. The repression of the shadow ensures that we remain predictable, that we consume endlessly in search of fulfillment, that we seek validation from the very structures that control us. Think of how religions often speak of sin and salvation, framing human impulses as battles between divine light and demonic darkness. Think of how modern culture preaches positivity and self-improvement, urging you to focus on your strengths, your best self, while dismissing the raw, uncomfortable truths about envy, greed, lust, or rage. Both systems share a common purpose: to keep you from looking too closely at the chaos within. Because if you did, you might not only discover freedom, you might also discover that the rules you've been living by were never meant to liberate you, but to domesticate you. Jung believed that without integration of the shadow, the human soul remains fractured. You cannot simply amputate the unwanted parts of yourself and expect to remain whole. Every monster you deny becomes stronger, and every desire you repress returns in distorted form. That is why people project their shadows onto others, blaming the neighbor, the foreigner, the rival, the politician, for the very impulses they cannot admit in themselves. Wars, discrimination, witch hunts, even gossip, they are all the external theater of inner denial. We fear the darkness in others because it reflects the darkness we dare not acknowledge in ourselves. But why is this so hard to face? Because to confront your shadow is to dismantle the story you've told yourself about who you are. The good person, the honorable worker, the devoted partner, these masks tremble when you admit that beneath them lies someone capable of rage, jealousy, cruelty, selfishness, and deceit. Yet, paradoxically, Jung argued that true morality, true strength, and true creativity only emerge when you acknowledge this darker half. For without it, your virtues are shallow, your freedom is an illusion, and your soul remains divided. Imagine, then, what it would mean to face your shadow without flinching. To admit, yes, I am capable of envy, of lust, of hatred, but these do not make me evil. They make me human. Such a realization is terrifying because it destabilizes the very foundation of your identity. And yet, it is liberating because it opens the door to wholeness. The problem is not that you have a shadow, it is that you refuse to face it. And until you do, you are not truly living, you are acting in a play written by forces you pretend not to see. So the question becomes, how does this unseen force shape not only our private lives but the collective destiny of societies? What happens when entire civilizations build themselves on the denial of the shadow? And what hidden consequences emerge when the darkness we repress returns to claim its place in history? The refusal to face the shadow does not vanish it into nothingness, it mutates it into something far more dangerous. Imagine a society where every individual believes they are virtuous, rational, and just, yet beneath this mask lies a festering reservoir of unacknowledged impulses. What happens when millions of repressed shadows collide? The answer is written across the blood-soaked pages of history. Every genocide, every witch hunt, every cultural purge begins with projection, the externalization of the shadow onto an enemy. Those who burned supposed witches in medieval Europe saw not their neighbors, but the reflection of their own unacknowledged desires for power, sexuality, and control. The wars of ideology, whether fought under religious banners or political ones, often begin not with reason but with a refusal to confront the chaos within. The shadow denied in the individual becomes the shadow enacted by the collective. Look at the modern world and you can see the same mechanism playing out. The endless outrage on social media, the polarization of politics, the scapegoating of minorities, all are symptoms of a culture that refuses to acknowledge its own darkness. The more a society insists on its moral superiority, the more violently it projects its unwanted truths onto others. This is why Jung warned that the greatest danger to humanity is not weapons or technology, but the unconsciousness of man. For an unconscious individual may ruin a family, but an unconscious collective may destroy a civilization. On a personal level, the consequences are no less devastating. The shadow does not remain silent when you refuse to face it, it manifests in neuroses, compulsions, and self-sabotage. Think of the person who insists they are always kind, yet secretly resents others and explodes in passive-aggressive outbursts. Or the individual who prides themselves on discipline but finds themselves addicted to substances, gambling, or toxic relationships. The shadow erupts in dreams, in slips of language, in moments of weakness where the carefully constructed persona shatters. Jung described dreams as the royal road to the unconscious, where the shadow often appears in the guise of frightening figures, monsters, or enemies. These are not random horrors but messages. The psyche is demanding integration, insisting that you face what you've exiled. Neurologically, this makes sense. The brain cannot simply erase unwanted impulses. Suppressed emotions like anger or fear remain active in neural circuits, creating stress, anxiety, and physical illness. Research shows that chronic repression is linked to higher cortisol levels, cardiovascular problems, and even weakened immune systems. In other words, when you exile parts of yourself, your body carries the burden of the denial. The price of refusing the shadow is not only spiritual fragmentation but also physical suffering. You may tell yourself you are fine, but your body keeps the score. Culturally, we see entire industries built upon this refusal. The beauty industry rides on our denial of aging and imperfection. The entertainment industry seduces us with fantasies where heroes are purely good and villains purely evil, distracting us from the truth that both reside within us. Even the self-help industry often reinforces this denial by urging constant positivity and affirmation, as if the path to freedom were to drown out the shadow with light rather than integrating both. But light without darkness is blindness. Consider how this dynamic shapes relationships. When you refuse to acknowledge your shadow, you inevitably project it onto those closest to you. The jealousy you deny in yourself, you accuse in your partner. The selfishness you bury, you resent in your friend. The ambition you repress, you condemn in your colleague. And so, relationships become mirrors of your own disowned traits, breeding conflict and misunderstanding. Many divorces, rivalries, and betrayals could be traced back to one truth: people are fighting not with others, but with the unacknowledged shadows of themselves. Now imagine this on a societal scale. When nations project their shadows, they create enemies to fight. The fear of their own aggression becomes the justification for preemptive wars. The denial of their own corruption becomes the weapon for accusing rivals of deceit. Totalitarian regimes thrive on the projection of collective shadows, uniting people through hatred of an other. And the terrifying irony is this: the more violently we fight the shadow outside, the more enslaved we become to the shadow within. But perhaps the most haunting consequence is existential emptiness. When you deny the shadow, you live only half a life. You pursue careers, relationships, and goals, but they feel hollow because they are built upon a mask rather than a whole self. Jung called this the tragedy of the unlived life, the parts of yourself you have never allowed to see the light of day. This is why midlife crises erupt, why people who have it all suddenly feel despair, why success often feels empty. The unlived life demands attention, and if ignored, it will turn the soul against itself. Think of the countless artists, philosophers, and creators who only found their voice by embracing their shadow. Dostoevsky confronted his darkness and produced literature that still shakes the human soul. Nietzsche wrestled with his demons and reshaped philosophy itself. Jung himself, through his confrontation with the unconscious in the Red Book, revealed visions and insights that still resonate today. Their greatness was not in their denial of the shadow, but in their courage to dialogue with it. What masterpieces of thought, art, or personal growth might remain buried because you have not yet dared to descend into your own depths? And so we return to the paradox: the very thing you fear most, the confrontation with your own darkness, is also the key to your wholeness. But this confrontation is not easy. It demands sacrifice, the sacrifice of illusions, of comfort, of the safety of denial. It asks you to stand before the abyss of your own psyche and admit, I am not only light. I am darkness too. And until you do, your freedom will remain an illusion, your choices will remain guided by unseen hands, and your destiny will not truly be your own. So here we arrive at the edge of rebellion. If the shadow enslaves us by hiding in the dark, then the only path to freedom is radical confrontation. But how does one rebel against an enemy that is not outside but inside? How do you fight the darkness without destroying yourself? And is it truly a battle, or is it something even more unsettling, an embrace? The rebellion, how to break free. The first act of rebellion is not resistance, but recognition. To rebel against the shadow is not to wage war upon it, but to drag it out of the abyss of unconsciousness and into the light of awareness. Jung warned that attempt to conquer the shadow only strengthens it, for you cannot destroy a part of yourself without also destroying your own wholeness. The shadow is not an intruder but your twin, exiled and silenced. Real rebellion begins when you dare to turn toward it, to look into the dark mirror of your own soul, and to whisper, I see you. But this is the most terrifying step, because it demands the death of illusions. You will no longer be able to hide behind the mask of the good person, the virtuous worker, the innocent victim. You must admit that you are capable of cruelty as well as kindness, envy as well as generosity, deceit as well as truth. And yet, in this terrifying admission lies liberation. For when you own your shadow, no one can use it against you. The accusations of others lose their sting, because you have already faced the truth within. History is filled with examples of individuals who embraced this rebellion and emerged transformed. Consider the Stoics of ancient Rome, who advised not denial of fear and anger, but awareness of them. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor-philosopher, wrote in his Meditations not of himself as a flawless ruler, but as a man wrestling daily with envy, pride, and despair. His greatness was not that he was pure light, but that he faced his darkness with brutal honesty. Or consider Nelson Mandela, who during decades of imprisonment confronted not only the injustice of apartheid but also the hatred within his own heart. His power to forgive did not come from denying his anger, but from transmuting it into strength. This is the essence of rebellion, transformation, not suppression. To integrate the shadow means to recognize its energy and redirect it. Your anger, once denied, becomes destructive. But if acknowledged, it can fuel justice. Your envy, left unconscious, corrodes relationships. But if faced, it reveals your deepest desires and awakens ambition. Even your selfishness, often condemned, can be transformed into self-respect and boundaries. Jung insisted that the shadow is not merely evil, it is also the wellspring of creativity, vitality, and authenticity. The energy you bury in repression is the very energy that, once integrated, can animate your soul. Practically, how does one begin? The first step is radical self-honesty. Notice when your reactions to others are disproportionate. When you despise someone, ask, what part of myself am I seeing in them that I cannot admit? Projection is the shadow's favorite disguise. Every enemy you create is often a reflection of an enemy within. By tracing these projections back, you begin to reclaim the exiled parts of yourself. The second step is dialogue. Jung himself engaged in what he called active imagination, a practice of conversing with figures from his unconscious during his exploration recorded in the Red Book. Rather than silencing these voices, he listened. You can do the same through journaling, dreams, or meditation, meeting your shadow as a character in the theater of your psyche. Ask it questions. Hear its answers. What does your anger want? What does your jealousy fear? What gift lies hidden in your darkest desire? The third step is integration through action. Once you recognize your shadow, you must give it expression, not destructively, but creatively. This is why art, writing, and ritual have always been tools of transformation. A repressed shadow seeks eruption, but an integrated shadow seeks creation. Think of how artists like Picasso or writers like Kafka poured their darkness into their work, transmuting chaos into beauty. You too can find outlets that give form to your inner abyss without letting it devour your life. But perhaps the most radical rebellion is the rejection of society's demand for perfection. The culture you inhabit thrives on your denial of darkness because it keeps you compliant, anxious, and consuming. To embrace your shadow is to break this cycle. It is to say, I do not need to are flawless. I do not need to be endlessly positive. I am whole precisely because I am both light and dark. This stance terrifies institutions because it produces individuals who cannot be manipulated through shame or fear. Imagine what a society would look like if millions dared to own their shadows, if instead of scapegoating and projection, people took responsibility for their inner lives. Wars would lose their fuel, politics would lose its demonization, and the machinery of fear would collapse. Yet, make no mistake, this path is not comfortable. To integrate the shadow is to live on the edge of contradiction, carrying the paradox of being both noble and base, angel and beast. But it is precisely here, in the tension of opposites, that Jung saw the birth of the self, the higher, integrated wholeness of a human being. He believed that individuation, the process of becoming truly oneself, is impossible without embracing the shadow. To flee from it is to remain a fragment, to face it is to become whole. So the rebellion is not about winning a battle but reclaiming your own soul. It is about stepping into the fire of your own darkness and emerging not purified, but complete. And when you do, you will discover a strange kind of freedom, the freedom to act not out of fear or compulsion, but out of conscious choice. But this raises one final and haunting question: if the rebellion is the embrace of the shadow, then what lies beyond? What ultimate truth emerges when you fully integrate light and dark, when you no longer see them as enemies but as partners? Could it be that the deepest freedom does not come from conquering darkness, but from discovering that darkness and light were never separate at all? The ultimate truth, the final, most powerful realization. Imagine, for a moment, that you have walked through the labyrinth of your psyche. You have faced the monsters in the arcade corridors, listened to the voices you once silenced, and embraced the parts of yourself you were taught to fear. You emerge, not purified in the way religion promises, not triumphant in the way myths often depict, but whole, carrying both the light and the darkness in equal measure. What realization dawns at the end of this journey? It is not the discovery of a final victory, but of a profound truth: the shadow was never your enemy. It was your teacher, your mirror, and the missing half of your soul. The ultimate revelation is paradoxical, unsettling, and yet deeply liberating. Freedom is not the absence of darkness, but the embrace of it. Light without shadow is blindness. Goodness without the possibility of evil is naivety. Strength without vulnerability is brittle. To be fully human is to carry contradictions, to embody opposites, to dance between chaos and order without needing to destroy either. Jung called this the process of individuation, the realization of the self as something far greater than the ego, a wholeness that transcends the split between light and dark. Philosophers across centuries have brushed against this truth. Nietzsche, in his vision of the Übermensch, insisted that greatness emerges not from suppressing instinct but from transforming it. One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star, he wrote. What he meant was not that chaos should reign, but that the energy we fear, if integrated, becomes the very force that generates creation. Similarly, Viktor Frankl, who endured the abyss of concentration camps, declared that freedom lies not in controlling external circumstances but in choosing one's attitude toward them. That choice emerges only when you no longer flee from yourself. Think of the irony: for so long, you were taught to seek freedom by running away, away from anger, away from envy, away from fear, away from the darkness. But true liberation requires turning back, descending into the very cave you fled, and realizing that the dragon guarding the treasure is not an obstacle, but an ally. The treasure is you, your unlived life, your disowned creativity, your raw vitality. The dragon is the shadow, demanding that you prove your courage by facing what you denied. And when you do, you see that the dragon was never separate from you, it was the very energy you needed to claim your wholeness. This is why Jung's insight feels both terrifying and empowering: until you face your darkness, you will never be free. But once you do, the darkness itself becomes a source of freedom. It is no longer the puppet master pulling your strings in secret. It becomes your ally, lending you strength, depth, and authenticity. When you admit you are capable of cruelty, your kindness becomes real. When you accept your envy, your admiration becomes sincere. When you face your fear of death, your love for life becomes fierce and unshakable. The shadow does not disappear, it transforms. On a societal level, this realization carries revolutionary implications. If individuals begin integrating their shadows, the machinery of projection collapses. Imagine a world where people no longer need to demonize others to avoid facing themselves. Wars would lose their fervor, ideologies their venom, politics its scapegoats. This is not to say conflict would vanish, but it would be fought with awareness rather than blindness, with responsibility rather than projection. Jung believed that the fate of humanity depends on this transformation, that only by confronting our collective shadow can we prevent catastrophe. In an age armed with nuclear weapons and digital manipulation, his warning feels more urgent than ever. But let us bring it back to you, to the intimate sphere of your own life. The final truth is that you do not become free by eliminating your shadow, nor by drowning it in light. You become free by walking with it. This means listening to your dreams, noticing your projections, embracing your contradictions, and daring to live the unlived life within you. It means taking responsibility for your darkness rather than blaming others for it. It means creating, loving, and acting not as a fragmented ego, but as a whole being who has embraced the abyss and found within it not annihilation, but integration. The paradox is profound. What once terrified you becomes your liberation. The very impulses you denied become the roots of your strength. The shadow, once your jailer, becomes your guide. And in this reconciliation, you discover that freedom was never about escaping darkness, it was about learning to carry it with light. So now the final question falls upon you like a weight and a gift: will you continue to live as a fragment, bound by the unconscious forces you refuse to face? Or will you take the harder road, the descent into the depths, the rebellion against denial, the journey toward wholeness? The path is not easy. It will shatter illusions, tear down masks, and demand courage that feels unbearable. But beyond that darkness lies something luminous, something eternal, the freedom to live as your whole self. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a vast ocean at night. The waves crash, the darkness stretches endlessly, and the stars above shimmer faintly. You feel fear, because you know the ocean hides dangers, creatures unseen. But then you realize, the same ocean is also life, possibility, depth. To live is not to avoid the ocean, but to dive into it, to swim in its depths, to learn its currents until you belong to it. That ocean is your psyche. That ocean is your shadow. And your freedom lies not in turning away from its darkness, but in learning to move with its tides. This is the final, most powerful realization: you cannot be free until you face your darkness. But once you do, you will discover a freedom so vast, so profound, that it makes the illusions of safety and denial seem like a prison. For in the end, freedom is not light without darkness, it is wholeness. And wholeness is the courage to be all that you are.